Hello everyone. Today I'm going to tell you some stories about cheating. The first story, The Rain, was a relentless percussion against the French doors, a soundtrack to the unraveling of Clara's world. She stood, a statue carved from guilt and regret, watching Liam across the living room. He sat hunched over his laptop, the blue light reflecting in his tired eyes, oblivious to the tremor that ran through her Liam, the man who still left her love notes tucked into her purse and brought her lilies every Friday, the man who built her a potting shed in the garden just because she loved to grow herbs. How could she have done this to him? It had started innocently enough. She'd met Julian, a journalist with a sharp mind and an even sharper wit, at a charity gala. Liam, swamped with work deadlines, hadn't been able to attend. Julian had sought her out, drawn to her quiet elegance. He'd asked about her work, her passions, listened intently while she spoke about her art, something Liam, in his loving practicality, often dismissed as a hobby. Julian had seen her. Or at least, that's what she'd convinced herself. He'd spun her stories of exotic lands he'd visited, of political intrigue and artistic revolutions, pulling her into a world so different from her comfortable, predictable life with Liam. The flattery had been intoxicating. The excitement, addictive. One thing led to another, as they always did in these tragic narratives. A late-night coffee after an interview, a stolen kiss in the rain, a blurred line between admiration and lust. The affair had been a short, intense flame, burning brightly for a few weeks before threatening to consume her entirely. Now, the flame had guttered out, leaving behind only the acrid stench of betrayal. Julian, with his restless spirit, had moved on to another assignment, another story, another woman perhaps. Leaving Clara alone, facing the consequences of her actions. She'd been a fool. A selfish, reckless fool. Liam was her harbor, her safe place, the anchor in her tumultuous sea of emotions. Julian had been a storm, a thrilling, dangerous squall that had ultimately left her shipwrecked on the shores of her own guilt. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the image of Liam's focused face. She had to tell him. She couldn't live with the lie any longer, the weight of it crushing her spirit. She cleared her throat, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent room. Liam didn't look up. "Liam," she said, her voice trembling. He finally raised his head, a weary smile gracing his lips. "Everything okay, love? You seem pale." The tenderness in his voice was a knife twisting in her gut. She wanted to run, to hide, to disappear. But she couldn't. She owed him the truth, however painful it might be. I have something to tell you," she stammered, her hands clammy. "It's difficult." Liam closed his laptop and turned to face her, his brow furrowing with concern. "What is it, Clara? You're scaring me." She took a deep breath, the air heavy in her lungs. The rain continued to beat against the windows, a relentless reminder of the storm raging inside her. I cheated on you, Liam." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The color drained from Liam's face. The smile vanished, replaced by a look of utter disbelief. "What?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Clara closed her eyes, bracing herself for the explosion she knew was coming. But it didn't. Instead, there was only silence, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain. She opened her eyes to see Liam staring at her, his face a mask of shock and hurt. "With whom?" he finally asked, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. With Julian, the journalist I met at the gala," she confessed, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. He stood up slowly, his movement stiff and unnatural. He walked to the window, staring out into the rain-lashed garden. The lilies he'd brought her just days ago were swaying violently in the wind. "Julian," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "The one who was so interested in your art." The rain seemed to intensify, as if the sky itself was weeping for their shattered happiness. Clara watched Liam, her heart breaking into a million pieces. She had destroyed the most beautiful thing in her life, and she didn't know if it could ever be repaired. The storm had passed, but the devastation it left behind was immeasurable. The silence hung heavy, pregnant with the unspoken questions, the raw pain, and the uncertain future that lay before them. The story of Clara and Liam was no longer a love story, but a tragedy in progress, its final chapter yet unwritten. The second story, the chlorine stung Clara's nostrils, a familiar, almost comforting scent that usually brought a sense of relaxation. Today, however, it was a constant, irritating reminder of her transgression. She sat on the edge of the sun-drenched pool, Peter, her husband, splashing contentedly with their daughter, Lily. Lily's squeals of laughter echoed around the pool deck, a sound that usually filled Clara's heart with joy, now twisted with guilt that it had started innocently enough. The summer had been stifling, the air thick with humidity. Peter, engrossed in a demanding project at work, was often distant, his mind preoccupied. Clara, feeling adrift in the sea of endless summer days, found herself drawn to the vibrant energy radiating from Finn, the young lifeguard. Finn was everything Peter wasn't in that moment: present, attentive, and brimming with youthful enthusiasm. He was tanned and sculpted, with sun-bleached hair and eyes the color of the Aegean Sea. He'd offered her a smile, a casual conversation about Lily's swimming lessons, then a shared ice cream cone on a particularly scorching afternoon. His attention had felt like a lifeline, the attraction had been undeniable, a dangerous current pulling her under. She'd told herself it was harmless, a flirtation, a brief escape. But then the flirtation deepened. Stolen glances turned into secret meetings after Lily was asleep, under the cloak of the humid summer night. Whispered promises against the chain-link fence surrounding the darkened pool. A kiss that tasted of chlorine and regret. And then, the ultimate betrayal. Now, watching Peter patiently teach Lily how to float, Clara felt a sharp pang of remorse. Peter, with his kind eyes and quiet strength, had always been her rock. He was the steady hand that guided their family, the unwavering support she could always rely on. And she had jeopardized everything for a fleeting moment of reckless desire. She saw Finn adjusting the pool noodles, his gaze flickering towards her for a fraction of a second before he looked away. He knew. They both knew. The unspoken burden of their secret weighed heavily on the sun-drenched air. Clara stood up abruptly, the plastic of the chair scraping against the concrete. "I'm going to grab some drinks," she announced, her voice sounding strained even to her own ears. As she walked towards the snack bar, she saw herself reflected in the large glass window. A woman etched with worry, her eyes haunted by the ghost of her actions. She bought the drinks and returned to her family, forcing a smile as she handed Peter a water bottle. Later that evening, after Lily was tucked into bed, Clara knew she couldn't keep it in any longer. She sat across from Peter at the kitchen table, the fluorescent light casting long shadows across their faces. He was scrolling through his phone, a small smile playing on his lips as he looked at photos of Lily from the day. "Peter," she began, her voice barely a whisper. I need to tell you something." He looked up, his smile fading slightly. "What is it, honey? You seem upset." Clara took a deep breath, the weight of her secret threatening to crush her. I made a mistake." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Peter's expression changed from concern to confusion, then slowly to dawning horror. She confessed everything, the words tumbling out of her like a torrent. She told him about Finn, about the loneliness, about the foolish, impulsive choices that had led her to this devastating moment. When she finished, the silence was deafening. Peter stared at her, his eyes filled with a pain so profound that it physically hurt Clara to witness. He didn't yell, he didn't scream. He just looked at her, his heart visibly breaking. "How could you, Clara?" he finally whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "How could you do this to us?" She had no answer. She had no excuses. All she could do was sit there, consumed by shame and regret, and watch as the foundation of her marriage crumbled before her very eyes. The days that followed were a blur of tears, accusations, and agonizing silence. Peter moved into the spare bedroom, the physical distance mirroring the chasm that had opened between them. Lily, sensing the tension in the air, became withdrawn and clingy. Clara knew she had inflicted irreparable damage. She had shattered the trust that had bound them together for so long. Whether they could ever rebuild was uncertain. All she knew was that the chlorine scent, once a symbol of relaxation, would forever serve as a stark reminder of her betrayal and the summer she almost lost everything. The pool, once a place of joy, now felt like a prison of her own making. And the biggest question lingered in the air: could they ever truly swim out of the deep end she had created? The third story, the rain was a relentless drummer against the windowpanes, mirroring the incessant, throbbing guilt in Sarah's chest. Across the room, Mark, her husband, was engrossed in a documentary about birds of Patagonia. His brow was furrowed in concentration, a tiny line etched between his eyes that she'd always found endearing. Tonight, however, it felt like a brand, searing itself into her conscience that she'd met David, the lawyer, 6 months ago. He was representing her company in a complicated acquisition. He was everything Mark wasn't: sharp, ambitious, and radiating an intoxicating confidence that made her feel seen. Mark was a historian, a gentle soul who found solace in dusty archives and the quiet unfolding of the past. David lived in the present, a master of manipulation and charm. It had started innocently enough: late nights working on the deal, shared dinners discussing strategies, and stolen glances across the boardroom table. Then, the line blurred. A lingering touch on her arm, a whispered compliment, and the dam broke. The guilt had been immediate, a cold, heavy stone in her stomach. But the allure of David, the intoxicating feeling of being desired in a way she hadn't felt in years, overrode it. Again and again. Now, the acquisition was finalized. David was moving on to another client, another deal. The flame that had burned so brightly had begun to flicker, leaving behind only the acrid smell of regret and the gnawing fear of discovery. She looked at Mark, at his peaceful face illuminated by the TV screen. He was oblivious. He loved her unequivocally. He brought her coffee in bed, listened patiently to her work woes, and made her laugh with his dry wit. He was her rock, her comfort, her home. And she had betrayed him in the most profound way possible. She excused herself, saying she had a headache. In the bathroom, she stared at her reflection. Her eyes, usually bright and full of life, were dull and haunted. She looked like a stranger, a woman she didn't recognize. She considered confessing. Throwing herself at Mark's mercy, begging for forgiveness. But the thought of the pain it would inflict on him, the devastation in his eyes, stopped her cold. He wouldn't understand. He was incapable of the kind of deceit she had perpetrated. It would shatter him. So, she did the only thing she could think of: she pretended. She took a shower, washed away the lingering scent of David's cologne that seemed to cling to her skin, and emerged with a forced smile. Feeling better? Mark asked, turning down the volume. Much better, she lied, settling beside him on the couch. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. His familiar scent of old books and lavender filled her nostrils. She leaned into him, pretending to find comfort in his embrace. Days turned into weeks. Sarah became adept at compartmentalizing her life. She was the dutiful wife, the successful executive, and the guilt-ridden betrayer. She avoided David, severing all contact. Every conversation with Mark felt like walking a tightrope. She lived in constant fear of being exposed, of the truth unraveling everything she held dear. One evening, while clearing out old files, she stumbled upon a faded photograph. It was from their wedding day. Mark, young and radiant, was gazing at her with an adoration that made her breath catch in her throat. The sight of it was like a physical blow. That night, the rain returned, even more relentless than before. She sat in the living room, watching the storm rage outside. Mark was asleep upstairs. The guilt was overwhelming, suffocating. She opened her laptop and began to write. Not a confession. Not yet. But a letter to David, pouring out her remorse, her regret, her absolute certainty that what they had done was wrong. She wrote until the words were blurred with tears, until her fingers cramped. Then, she deleted it. Deleting the letter, she realized, was symbolic. It was her attempt to erase the past, to bury it so deeply that it could never resurface. It was a desperate act of self-preservation. She walked upstairs and slipped into bed beside Mark. He stirred in his sleep, reaching out to hold her hand. His grip was firm, comforting. She closed her eyes, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. She knew she could never truly escape the guilt, that it would forever be a part of her. But she also knew that she had made a choice. A selfish, perhaps cowardly, choice. But a choice nonetheless. She would cling to the life she had built with Mark, the love they shared, however flawed it might be. She would try, every single day, to be the woman he deserved. And she would pray that the storm inside her, the one that had led her astray, would eventually subside, leaving behind only the quiet, enduring strength of love. But the rain still pounded on the roof, a constant reminder of the secret she carried, a weight she would bear alone, forever. The fourth story, the scent of old paper and brewing coffee should have been a sanctuary, a haven from the sterile world of MRIs and insurance claims. But for Arthur, the Northwood Library had become a battlefield. It was here, amidst the quiet rustling of pages and the gentle hum of the fluorescent lights, that he was warring with himself, with the choices he'd made, with the ghost of a touch he couldn't seem to shake. His wife, Eleanor, was a force of nature, a whirlwind of efficiency and unwavering love. She was a doctor, her days spent battling disease, her nights devoted to him and their meticulously organized home. Arthur, on the other hand, was a graphic designer, a creature of habit and comfortable routines. He loved Eleanor fiercely, admired her strength, and appreciated the stability she provided. Yet, somewhere along the way, the vibrant tapestry of their marriage had faded into a muted, predictable landscape. Then there was Clara, the librarian. She was the antithesis of Eleanor in almost every way. Clara possessed a quiet, unassuming beauty, a gentle spirit that seemed to emanate from her like the scent of aged leather. She knew Arthur's name, his favorite authors, the precise time he arrived each day to browse the art section. She offered him recommendations with a shy smile, engaged him in conversations about obscure artists, and listened to him, really listened, to his anxieties about deadlines and the creeping feeling that his creativity was drying up. The lines blurred slowly, imperceptibly at first. A shared laugh over a mislabeled book. A lingering hand brushing his as she returned his library card. A stolen glance across the reading room that felt both forbidden and exhilarating. Then, one rainy afternoon, after a particularly frustrating meeting with a demanding client, Arthur found himself seeking refuge in the library. Clara saw the storm brewing in his eyes, and, without a word, led him to the quietest corner, a sun-drenched nook overlooking the park. They talked for hours, about everything and nothing. He told her about the pressure he felt, the monotony that was slowly suffocating him. She listened, offering not solutions, but understanding, and then, it happened. A moment of weakness, a fleeting connection that spiraled out of control. A kiss, hesitant and tentative, then desperate and undeniable. The guilt gnawed at him from the moment he stepped out of the library that day, a constant, throbbing ache. He tried to bury it, to convince himself it was a lapse in judgment, a moment of madness. But the memory of Clara's soft lips, the feel of her hand in his, haunted him. He saw Eleanor's face, her unwavering trust in him, and felt a stab of profound shame that he became withdrawn, distant. Eleanor, ever perceptive, noticed. "Are you all right, Arthur?" she asked one evening, her brow furrowed with concern that he wanted to tell her, to confess everything. But the words caught in his throat, choked by the fear of shattering their world, of inflicting a pain he knew she didn't deserve. Instead, he stammered, "Just stressed, work's been hectic." The lie hung heavy in the air that he started avoiding the library, taking a longer route to the grocery store, inventing excuses to stay late at his studio. But Clara's presence was like a phantom limb, a constant reminder of his betrayal. He saw her in every woman with dark hair and kind eyes. One day, he received a small, handwritten note in the mail. No return address, just his name on the envelope. Inside, a single sentence, "I understand." He knew it was from Clara. The simplicity of the message, the lack of accusation, was a brutal indictment. She understood the magnitude of his transgression, the impossibility of their connection, that he finally decided he had to confront Eleanor, to tear the band-aid off and face the consequences. He sat her down that evening, his hands shaking, his voice barely a whisper. He confessed everything: the creeping discontent, the stolen moments with Clara, the kiss that had shattered his world. Eleanor listened in silence, her face a mask of disbelief. When he was finished, she simply got up and walked out of the room. The following days were a blur of tears, accusations, and strained silences. Eleanor moved into the spare bedroom. The comfortable routines they had established over years of marriage were replaced by a cold, desolate emptiness. Eventually, they started talking again. Tentatively, awkwardly, like strangers navigating a minefield. Eleanor was angry, hurt, and deeply betrayed. But beneath the anger, Arthur saw a flicker of something else, a flicker of compassion, of a willingness to understand. That he didn't expect forgiveness, not right away. But he promised her honesty, transparency, and a commitment to rebuilding their trust. He cut off all contact with Clara. He went to therapy, individually and with Eleanor. Rebuilding their marriage wouldn't be easy. The scars of his betrayal would remain, a constant reminder of the damage he had inflicted. But Arthur was determined. He knew he had almost lost everything, and he was willing to fight for the chance to earn back Eleanor's love, to create a new, stronger, and more honest foundation for their future. He had learned a devastating lesson amidst the quiet shelves of the Northwood Library, a lesson about the fragility of trust, the destructive power of secrets, and the enduring strength of love, even when it's been broken. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would spend the rest of his life trying to make it right.